Settle in, let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There's nowhere you need to be tonight except right here, drifting slowly downward into a story that most people only think they know. In the spring of 1943, the United States government began building three secret cities. They appeared in a Tennessee valley, on a stretch of Washington desert, and on a mesa in New Mexico. Together, they eventually held more than 120,000 people. Those cities had schools, and bowling alleys, and cafeterias, and maternity wards. They had bus routes, and softball leagues, and Saturday night dances, and almost none of the people living in them knew what they were building. That's the part that gets left out. When most of us picture the Manhattan Project, we picture a small room full of men in wire-rimmed glasses, chalk dust on their sleeves, arguing about equations. But for every physicist, there were hundreds of ordinary people, welders, pipe fitters, secretaries, farm girls from East Tennessee who had never used a telephone, janitors, bus drivers, chemists barely out of school. They came for the wages and the work, and because there was a war on, and they stayed for years inside fences they weren't allowed to describe, doing jobs they weren't allowed to understand. Tonight, you're going to be one of them. Before we go in through the gate, if you enjoy these long, slow walks through history, subscribe so the next one finds you, and leave a comment with the oldest story your family still tells. The one that gets repeated at every funeral and every wedding, that nobody can quite verify, that changes a little every time. A great grandmother who crossed an ocean, a relative who worked somewhere they never talked about. If your family doesn't have one of those, just tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's a quiet pleasure reading through them. Now, get comfortable. The letter has already arrived. It comes on a Tuesday or a Thursday. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it's thin and official, and it says almost nothing. You read it twice. There is a job. The job is war work. The pay is better than anything within 50 miles of where you're standing. There is housing. There is a location, sort of, a rail junction, a county name, a set of instructions for where to present yourself and when. There is no description of the work. There is no title. There is no explanation of who exactly is employing you, though the letterhead belongs to a company you've heard of, and the money you will learn comes from somewhere else entirely. If you're a young woman in Tennessee in 1943, the recruiter came to your high school. He stood at the front of a room that smelled of chalk and floor wax and told a group of 18-year-olds that the government needed workers, that the pay was good, that the work was important, and that he could not tell them what it was. Some of the girls laughed. Some of them signed anyway. Your mother cried a little and then packed you a case and then said, "Well, at least it's not overseas." If you're a machinist in Detroit, or a pipe fitter in Pittsburgh, or a carpenter who has been out of steady work since before the crash, the offer arrives through the union hall, or through a friend of a friend, or through a newspaper advertisement that promises high wages and permanent employment and says nothing else at all. You have a family to feed. The advertisement does not need to say more. You will notice later that this was deliberate. The recruiting was designed to be uninformative in a way that did not seem strange. People were used to being told less than they wanted to know. There was a war on. Everyone had a cousin who had disappeared into some camp or shipyard or coastal installation and come back thinner and quieter. The vagueness was camouflage, and it worked because it was ordinary. So you sign, you give notice, you sell what won't fit in a case, you tell your neighbors you've got war work, and they nod because half the street has war work, and nobody asks the second question. The last thing the letter tells you is not to discuss any of this with anyone. It is phrased politely. It sounds like a formality. It is not a formality. The journey is the first strange thing. You board a train with a ticket that names a town you've never heard of, and when you ask the conductor about it, he says he'll tell you when you're close. The car fills up with people who look like you, young, carrying too little luggage, glancing at each other with the particular shyness of strangers who suspect they are all going to the same place and have all been told not to say so. Somebody eventually breaks. A boy from Kentucky asks the girl across from him where she's headed, and she says Knoxville in a way that clearly means not Knoxville, and he says, "Huh, me too," and they both smile and look out the window, and that is the entire conversation. You learn the etiquette fast. You can say the county, you can say the state, you can say war work. You cannot say more because you don't know more, and because the not knowing is starting to feel less like an accident and more like a wall someone built. The train slows at a small station in the middle of farmland. There is no town. There are buses, dozens of them, olive drab and dusty, idling in a field that was a cow pasture 18 months ago. A man with a clipboard reads names. You climb aboard. The bus pulls onto a road that is brand new and already ruined, and for the next 40 minutes, you watch the countryside change into something you have no word for. There are trucks, hundreds of trucks, thousands, moving in both directions, hauling lumber and pipe and gravel and steel. There are hillsides scraped down to raw orange clay. There are construction camps, and rows of identical roofs, and men swarming over the skeletons of buildings so large your eye can't finish them. There is a smell of diesel and turned earth and wet concrete. And there are fences, miles of chain link, 7 feet high, topped with barbed wire that leans inward, which you notice because barbed wire that leans inward is not designed to keep people out. Then the checkpoint. Armed guards, uniforms, a gate across the road, and a small building beside it, and a soldier who steps onto the bus and walks the aisle, looking at faces. Papers are collected, papers are returned. Somebody's aren't in order, and they're taken off the bus politely, and you never find out what happened to them. The gate lifts, the bus rolls through. Behind you, the gate comes down. This is the moment people remember for the rest of their lives, and they all describe it the same way. Not fear, exactly. Something more like a door closing in a house you've just moved into, a sound that tells you the shape of the place you're now inside of. You are, from this second forward, a person who lives behind a fence. Your mail will be read. Your address will be a post office box. Your conversations will be, at least sometimes, overheard on purpose. You didn't agree to that precisely. You agreed to a job. The bus crests a low rise, and you get your first real look at where you'll be living. It is not a town. It is a town being born all at once, with no patience, buildings going up faster than the roads to reach them, a whole valley churned into an enormous construction site under a sky the color of dishwater. And it is, all of it, absolutely swimming in mud. You need to understand about the mud because everyone who was there talks about it before they talk about anything else. 50 years later, sitting in a comfortable chair with a microphone in front of them, they will start the story with the mud. East Tennessee clay is orange red and fine, and it holds water like a sponge holds water. Now take a valley of that clay, strip every tree and every root and every bit of grass off of it. Drive 40,000 truckloads of heavy equipment across it, and then let it rain the way it rains in Tennessee for days, in sheets, warm and relentless. What you get is not mud in the sense you're used to. It is a substance. It is ankle deep on the good days and knee deep on the bad ones. It sucks the shoes off your feet. It pulls the boots off soldiers. Cars sink to their axles and stay there until a truck with a chain comes to haul them out. People fell in it and had to be helped up. Women coming off shift in the dark would step off a boardwalk in the wrong place and go down, and there are stories, probably improved with retelling, but told by too many people to be nothing, of small children being lost momentarily in it, and of a hat sitting on the surface with a man's voice underneath saying he was fine, he was standing on a truck. The answer to the mud was boardwalks, miles of them, rough planks laid end to end on the churned ground, connecting the dormitories to the bus stops, and the bus stops to the cafeterias, and the cafeterias to the plants. At night, in the blackout gloom, you learned to walk them by feel. If you met someone coming the other way, one of you stepped off into the muck, and the etiquette of who stepped off was worked out silently in about half a second, and it was almost always the person in work clothes rather than the person in a dress, because there were dances on Saturdays, and dresses were hard to replace. You buy boots. Everyone buys boots. You keep a second pair of shoes in a bag and change at the door, and every building has a scraper and a mat and a small archaeology of dried orange clay accumulating in the corners. Your good stockings are ruined within a week, and you learn not to care. The laundry runs constantly and never catches up. And here is the thing that surprises you. You get used to it. Not in the sense of enjoying it, but in the sense that it becomes weather rather than catastrophe. It becomes the thing you complain about with people you're starting to like. The mud is the first thing that makes you all the same. It doesn't care about your education or your accent or the town you came from. The chemist with the doctorate and the girl who left school at 16 are both scraping the same orange clay off the same cheap boots in the same doorway, laughing, late for the same bus. In summer, it dries out and becomes dust instead, so fine it gets into your food and your bedding and the creases of your elbows, and you find yourself missing the mud, which is an insane thing to miss, and you say so, and someone agrees with you. They will call this place the Secret City later. The people who lived there called it Dog Patch. Housing is assigned, and what you are assigned tells you almost everything about your place in the invisible order of this place. At the top, though nobody uses the word top, are the Semesto houses. Cement and asbestos board panels, prefabricated, dropped onto foundations by crews that could put up a house in a day. They come in letters. An A house is small, a D house has more bedrooms, an F house is generous, and the letter you get depends on your job classification and your family size. They are not luxurious. They are warm, dry, and yours, with a small kitchen and a coal furnace and a patch of raw earth out front that in a year or two might be a lawn. Wives who arrive from apartments in Pittsburgh find them cramped. Wives who arrive from farmhouses without electricity find them close to miraculous. Below that are the flat tops, plywood boxes on posts meant to last 5 years, still standing decades later. Below that, trailers, thousands of them, laid out in grids with shared bathhouses. Below that, dormitories, long 2-story buildings, a corridor with rooms off it, 2 women to a room or 2 men, a bathroom down the hall, a house mother at the front desk with a book she writes your name in. If you're a single woman in a dormitory, you have a curfew, a roommate you didn't choose, and a set of rules about male visitors that are enforced with real seriousness by a woman who has decided that the war effort includes keeping you out of trouble. You have a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a shared iron, and a window. You may have come from a house with 6 siblings in it, in which case, this is the first room you've ever had that was even half yours. And below all of that are the hutments. A hutment is a 16-foot plywood square. No insulation, no plumbing, no windows in the glass sense. Shutters that prop open in summer and are meant to be closed against the winter, which doesn't work because there is no insulation. A coal stove in the middle, 4 or 5 cots around it, a single light bulb. Outside, a communal latrine and a water pump and a bathhouse you queue for. Who lives in hutments depends on when you arrive and who you are. Early on in the frantic first months, a lot of white construction workers live in them too, because there is simply nowhere else, and they gripe and they endure, and then as the permanent housing goes up, they move out. Black workers do not move out. That's the sentence, and it deserves its own space, and we'll come back to it properly. For now, know only that the housing map of this town is also a map of something else, and that everybody living there could read it perfectly well, and that most of them, most of the time, went to work and came home and said nothing about it, which is its own kind of fact about the year 1944 in the American South. You put your case on your bed. You look at the window. Somewhere outside, a whistle blows, and a shift changes, and 10,000 people move at once. Tomorrow you find out what you actually do. The badge comes first. Before the job, before the training, before anyone tells you a single useful thing, you are photographed, fingerprinted, and issued a rectangle of laminated card with your face on it and a color that determines the shape of your entire existence here. The photograph is taken in a room with a stool and a height chart and a bored man behind a camera, and it comes out looking like a mugshot because it is essentially a mugshot. The fingerprinting is done in silence. Somewhere, at some point, people you will never meet went to the town you grew up in and asked your neighbors and your teachers and your former employers whether you were reliable, whether you drank, whether you had opinions. Some of them will remember this decades later and mention it at Thanksgiving. Nobody told you it was happening. Then the color. The badge color says which gates you may pass and which buildings you may enter, and everyone learns to read them at a glance, the way you'd read a rank insignia. A badge that gets you into the plant does not get you into every part of the plant. A badge that gets you into your own building does not get you into the room next door. There are men who work for 2 years in a facility the size of a small town, and see perhaps 4% of it. You wear it clipped to your chest at all times inside the fence. If you forget it, you go home for it, and it costs you a shift. If you lose it, there is a process, and the process involves explaining yourself to someone who is not friendly about it. If you're caught in a building your badge doesn't cover, even by an honest wrong turn, there is a report, and the report goes somewhere, and you may or may not ever hear about it again. And that uncertainty, you slowly realize, is the point. At the gates, you queue, every shift, both directions. Guards check your face against your photograph. Bags are inspected. Cameras are forbidden, flatly, absolutely. And the prohibition holds so well that the photographic record of 100,000 people's daily lives across 3 years is almost entirely made by a handful of official photographers with permission. Somebody's baby pictures exist because a supervisor made an exception. Most people's don't. There is a rule about writing, too. You cannot take notes out of the plant. You cannot take a scrap of paper with a number on it. Some workers develop the habit of memorizing things they aren't supposed to write down and then deliberately forgetting them on the bus home, which sounds impossible and which quite a few of them describe doing. And here is the strange comfort in it. The badge tells you where you may go, and by telling you that, it also tells you where you need not think about going. A great many people found this restful. The boundaries were clear. Your curiosity had an edge to it, marked in color, and past that edge was somebody else's business, and somebody else's business was not your problem, and there was a war on, and dinner was at 6. It is amazing how quickly a human being can decide not to wonder. Let's say you're one of the young women at the electromagnetic plant. Thousands of you are. You're mostly 19, 20, 22. You came off farms and out of small towns, and before this year, the largest machine most of you had operated was a sewing machine or a tractor. They walk you into a room, and it is enormous, and it is loud, and it curves. The building is built in a great oval, and along the inside wall of the oval is a row of panels, and in front of each panel is a stool, and on each stool sits a girl exactly like you. Your panel has dials, it has gauges, it has a needle behind glass, and a set of knobs beneath the needle, and that is your entire world for 8 hours a day. The instruction you are given is this: keep the needle here, there is a mark. When the needle drifts left, you turn this knob a little. When it drifts right, you turn it back. If the needle jumps and won't settle, you write the time on a sheet and you notify your supervisor. You do not ask what the needle measures. You do not ask what is on the other side of the wall. You do not discuss your panel with the girl on the next stool, even though she is doing exactly the same thing, even though you eat lunch together and share a dormitory room and will be at each other's weddings. There are supervisors walking the floor constantly. Some of them are pleasant, some of them are not. All of them are watching, and some of them are watching for reasons that have nothing to do with the needles. You are, at this moment, operating a mass spectrograph the size of a house. On the other side of that wall is a vacuum tank and an electromagnet so powerful it pulls the hairpins out of your hair as you walk past a certain corridor, a thing that genuinely happened and that women complained about and that they were told to stop wondering about. Inside that tank, A beam of ionized uranium is being bent through a curve, and the heavier atoms swing slightly wider than the lighter ones. And at the end of the curve, there are two collection pockets a few inches apart. Over the course of a shift, your steady needle contributes a quantity of separated material best measured in specks. You know none of this. You know the needle. And here is the part that people find hardest to believe. You are better at this job than the physicists are. That is not a compliment invented later to be nice. It was measured. There were trials in which trained scientists ran the panels, and the young women ran the panels, and the young women got more product through consistently. The reason was not intelligence, and everybody involved knew it. The reason was that when a needle behaved oddly, a physicist wanted to know why, and stopped and investigated and took the machine offline to satisfy his curiosity. The girl from Clinton, Tennessee, had been told what to do when the needle behaved oddly, and she did it, and the machine kept running. A system built to prevent people from understanding their work turned out to run better when nobody understood it. There is something in that worth turning over slowly in the dark before you sleep. The rules are everywhere, and after a while you stop seeing them the way you stop seeing wallpaper. There are billboards inside the fence, not advertisements, reminders. A cartoon of three monkeys, a drawing of a sinking ship, a grim illustration of a soldier with the caption asking whether you'd like to explain yourself to him, and the one everybody remembers, painted large where the buses turn, what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. There are rules with numbers and rules without. You may not discuss your work with your spouse. You may not discuss your work with a coworker in a different building. You may not discuss your work with a coworker in your own building unless it is necessary to do the work in front of you. You may not speculate. You may not, and this one is enforced with real energy. Use certain words. There is a small vocabulary of forbidden terms, and the words uranium and atom and bomb are among them, and people are dismissed for saying them out loud, sometimes in jest, sometimes to see what would happen. What you use instead is a private language. The material is the product. The device is the gadget. Uranium is tuballoy, a fake name invented to sound like a boring industrial alloy. The plants have letters instead of names. The whole town has a code word. You send letters home with an address that is a post office box in a city you don't live in. Compartmentalization is the official term, and the man running the project believed in it the way some people believe in scripture. The logic is simple then cold. A person cannot reveal what they do not possess. So you are given exactly the information required to perform your specific function and not one sentence more, and the wall between your function and the function of the man 20 feet away is as real as the wall between you and the enemy. The practical results are absurd and constant. Two chemists work in adjoining laboratories on halves of the same problem for a year without being permitted to compare notes. An engineer designs a pipe run for a building whose purpose he is not told and must ask permission to know whether the fluid inside will be hot. A welder is instructed to weld to a tolerance he considers insane for the application he assumes and complains and is told to weld it anyway and does. Later, he finds out what was going through the pipe and goes very quiet. And there is a second effect, harder to name. When you cannot ask questions, you stop forming them. It's a muscle. Unused, it softens. Workers describe arriving with a burning curiosity that lasted about 6 weeks and then simply went out, replaced by a kind of practiced blankness that they could switch on when a stranger asked what they did. What did you do? I worked at the plant. What did you do at the plant? I watched a dial. What was the dial for? I don't know. And they meant it. That was the strangest, most successful thing about the whole arrangement. That 100,000 people said, I don't know, and were telling the plain truth. Nobody cooks much at first because there is nowhere to cook and nothing to cook with. The cafeterias are the answer. Enormous, steamy, echoing rooms with steel counters and trays and a rotation of women in hairnets who have been on their feet since 4 in the morning. They run around the clock because the plants run around the clock, and a man coming off the graveyard shift wants his supper at 7 in the morning and gets it, eggs and grits and coffee strong enough to lift a shoe. The food is fine. That's the honest verdict. It is not good and it is not bad. It is institutional, plentiful, and hot, and for a startling number of the young people arriving from the rural South, it is the most reliable eating they have ever done in their lives. Meat several times a week, milk that comes in a bottle instead of from a cow you also have to feed, dessert, actual dessert, every day if you want it. There are girls who put on 15 pounds in their first 6 months and write home about it as good news, because in the world they came from, that was good news. Rationing exists here as it exists everywhere, and it is worse here in one specific way. Everybody arrived at once. Ration books are issued to a population that appeared overnight in a place with no established grocery trade. The stores are prefabricated buildings with half empty shelves and a truck that comes when it comes. So a habit develops, and everyone who was there describes it in nearly identical words. If you see a line, get in it. Get in it first and find out what's at the end of it second. It might be nylons, it might be cigarettes, it might be shoes in your size, or oranges, or a shipment of that particular soap everyone likes. You take your place, you make friends with the woman ahead of you, and you buy whatever it is, and if it's useless to you, you trade it to somebody in your dormitory for something that isn't. That trading economy becomes its own social world. Coffee for cigarettes, a ration stamp for a favor. Somebody's brother in law works in supply and can sometimes find things. Somebody's neighbor has a car and a gas allowance and will drive to Knoxville on Saturday if 3 people chip in and one of them holds the baby. Cigarettes are the real currency, as they were everywhere in the 40s, and the shortage of them causes more open complaint than the shortage of almost anything else. There are documented near riots over a cigarette delivery. There is no documented near riot over anything that happened inside the plants, which tells you something about human priorities under stress. Married couples with a house eventually cook. A kitchen becomes a status symbol. An invitation to dinner at somebody's Semesto house, real dinner on real plates with a tablecloth, is the height of local hospitality, and the guests bring their own butter, and everybody is very careful not to look too closely at where the butter came from. At the end of a long shift, in a steel and steam cafeteria, with orange clay drying on your boots, eating a plate of somebody else's cooking beside 400 people whose jobs you are not permitted to ask about. That is dinner every night for years. Let's talk about the wages, because the wages are the reason most people came, and any account that pretends otherwise is being romantic about something that was, for the people involved, a job. If you left a farm in East Tennessee in 1943, you left a cash income that might have been a few $100s in a good year, most of it arriving in a lump after the harvest, and most of that going straight back out to the seed store. Here, you are handed an envelope every single week. It has money in it, real money, more per week than your father sometimes cleared per month, and it keeps happening, and it does not depend on rain. For a young woman, this is transformative in a way that is difficult to overstate. Before this, the paid work available to you was likely to be domestic service, textile work at a mill rate, or nothing. Now you have your own wage, your own room, your own bed, and a bus that takes you to a movie theater on Saturday. You send money home, and you keep money, and the keeping is new. Women who lived through it talk about the first thing they bought themselves: a coat, a wristwatch, a pair of shoes chosen for looks rather than durability, and they remember it precisely, decades later, because it was the first object in their life that was purely their own decision. For skilled tradesmen, the arithmetic is different, but the direction is the same. Overtime is essentially unlimited. The project is behind schedule from the first day to the last, and there is always another shift available, and men work 60 and 70-hour weeks and take home pay packets that let them clear debts left over from the 30s. Some of them are working off mortgages that had been quietly sinking them for a decade. The war bond drives are relentless. Payroll deduction is normal. Posters ask you personally whether you're doing your part, and there are competitions between buildings and shifts, and a certain amount of public shaming attached to the results. Most people buy, partly from patriotism and partly because everyone can see the list. Prices inside the fence are controlled, rents are low, and there is nowhere obvious to spend, so savings accumulate. This is one of the quietly enormous facts about the whole enterprise. Tens of thousands of working class Americans, many of them from the poorest counties in the country, spent 3 years earning steadily and spending little, and came out the other side with money in the bank for the first time in their family's history. Houses got bought with it. Small businesses got started with it. Children got sent to school with it. And there is a cost buried in it that nobody itemized. You are working long hours in a place your family cannot visit, doing something you cannot describe, and the money is so good that leaving feels foolish, and so you stay another year and another. The pay is the fence's inside lining. Nobody has to lock a door that people don't want to walk out of. You count the envelope, you put some away, you get on the bus. Now, the part that the brochures left out, and that the town itself was slow to say out loud. The secret city was built in Tennessee in 1943, and it was segregated. Not incidentally, not as an oversight, but by design, in the plans, on the drawings, in the housing assignments, and the cafeteria layouts, and the recreation halls, and the bus queues. Around 10% of the workforce was black. They came from the same kind of places as everyone else: farms and small towns across the South, following the same recruiters and the same promise of wages. What waited for them was not what waited for the white recruits. The jobs, almost entirely, were the ones nobody else wanted: janitorial work, digging, hauling, kitchen work, laundry. The skilled trades were largely closed, and the operator positions, the dials, the panels, the clean indoor work with the good hours, were closed too. Men who arrived with training as carpenters or mechanics found themselves handed a mop. The housing was the hutments, not for the first 6 months until the permanent construction caught up. Permanently, 16 feet square, plywood, coal stove, no plumbing, communal latrine, and this is the detail that makes people put their hand over their mouth when they hear it. The hutment areas were segregated by sex. Married couples who had come together, who had left children with grandmothers to do it, were assigned to separate huts in separate fenced compounds with a guard and a gate between them. Husbands and wives, living a few hundred yards apart, permitted to visit during certain hours, sleeping in rooms with four strangers of their own sex for years. Children were not allowed in the black areas at all, so the families that had left children behind could not send for them, and the mothers among them worked and sent money home and saw their own children on rare, expensive trips out through the gate. One woman, whose account survives because someone finally thought to ask her about it, long afterward, worked as a janitor in one of the plants and lived in a hut a short walk from her husband's, and described the arrangement without much drama, the way people describe weather they had no power over. She missed her children. She sent the money. She stayed. When she talked about it later, what came through was not bitterness, so much as an enormous patient endurance, and a clear-eyed understanding that she had been offered a bargain in which the good part was real and the bad part was deliberate. There were protests, quiet ones and less quiet ones. Church groups formed. Complaints went up the chain and mostly stopped somewhere in the middle of it. A few things loosened slowly, and mostly after the war ended, and the town began to argue with itself about what it wanted to be. The schools did not integrate for another decade. Here is what needs saying, and it is not complicated. The same government that was assembling the most sophisticated scientific effort in human history, that could split an atom and build a city from nothing in 18 months, looked at the housing plan for that city and put a fence down the middle of it, and everyone involved could see the fence, and it stayed. Both of those things were the Manhattan Project. Neither one cancels the other. You just have to carry them at the same time. Now shift, in the way you can in a dream, from a wet green valley in Tennessee to a place with no water in it at all. In eastern Washington, along a wide, slow bend of the Columbia River, there was sagebrush and sand and a great deal of sky. There were two small farming towns, White Bluffs and Hanford, where a few hundred people grew orchard fruit on irrigated land and had been doing so for 40 years. There were the ancestral lands of the Wanapum and other Columbia River peoples who had fished that stretch of river for longer than any of it had been written down. In early 1943, the government arrived and told the farming towns to leave. The notices gave some families a matter of weeks. The compensation was assessed quickly, and by nearly every account of the people who received it, badly. Orchards valued as raw land, a lifetime of work priced like scrub. There were appeals. The appeals took years, and mostly failed. Crops were left standing in the fields, and the families drove out, and afterward the fruit fell and rotted where it grew, and the buildings were used for target practice or simply left to the wind. The river peoples lost access to fishing grounds and burial places that they have spent every decade since trying to protect. That is where the site was put. It was chosen for exactly the reasons that made it terrible to live near. Enormous quantities of cold river water, cheap hydroelectric power from the big dams, flat ground, and hundreds of square miles of nothing at all in every direction, so that if the thing being attempted went badly wrong, it would go wrong where nobody was standing. Then 50,000 people arrived. The construction camp that went up was, briefly, one of the largest temporary settlements in America. Barracks in ranks, mess halls that fed thousands at a sitting, with cooks working in shifts around the clock and food arriving by the boxcar. A recreation hall, a beer hall that was by universal agreement the most reliably crowded building on the site. Trailers, tents in the early days, dust everywhere. The work was construction on a scale that even the men doing it found hard to describe. Reactor buildings with walls of graphite and concrete, chemical separation plants so long and so windowless that the workers called them the canyons, 100 miles of new road, a new rail line, water plants, power lines marching off toward the dams. And nobody knew anything. It was the same rule as Tennessee, applied to a workforce that was rougher, more transient, and considerably more inclined to say what it thought. Men welded pipe to specifications that made no sense. Men poured concrete forms of bewildering shape. Men installed instrumentation with more redundancy than any refinery on earth and asked what it was for and were told to install it. If you were there, you were in a barracks with 150 other men in a desert, a long way from anywhere, working 6 days a week for the best wages of your life, in a job you couldn't explain, in a landscape that seemed determined to remove you from it. Because in the afternoon, the wind came up. They had a name for it, which tells you how routine it was. In the afternoons, especially in spring, the wind would rise off the flats and pick up the loose sand of a landscape that had just had its sagebrush scraped off by bulldozers, and it would carry that sand across the site in a brown wall. The men called the dust termination powder, and the wind that brought it termination wind, because when it blew hard enough, a certain number of workers would walk straight to the personnel office at the end of the shift and terminate their employment on the spot. You cannot really overstate the dust. It got into everything, and everything is not a figure of speech. Into food, into bedding, into engines, into your eyes and your teeth and the seams of your clothes. Visibility would drop to a few feet. Men working outdoors tied handkerchiefs over their faces and worked blind by feel. You came off shift with a rim of grit in every crease of your skin, showered, and found more of it in your hair the next morning. Meals in the mess hall were eaten fast because a plate left sitting acquired a film. The turnover at that site was enormous. Something like 100,000 people passed through over the course of the project to keep a workforce of 50,000 standing at any one moment. People arrived, looked at the barracks and the sand and the distance to the nearest town of any size, worked a week or a month, and left. Recruiters worked constantly just to hold the line. There were periods when the project was hiring more or less continuously in a dozen states, simply to replace the people walking out the gate. Those who stayed developed a hard local pride about it, the way people do. You learned which side of the barracks to walk on. You learned to keep a wet cloth over the food. You learned the exact hour the wind usually started and got the outdoor work done before it. You learned to sleep through the sound of sand against the wall, which is a sound like rain and nothing like rain. And on the good days, and there were good days, the desert did what deserts do. The wind dropped at evening, and the whole enormous sky went orange and then violet, and the river ran cold and green and fast, and men who had grown up in coal towns and mill towns stood outside a barracks in the dark, looking at more stars than they had ever seen in their lives. There were fishing trips on the Columbia. There were baseball games in the dust, taken very seriously, with real rivalries between crews. There was a recreation hall with a band on Saturdays, and a shortage of women so severe that the arrival of a busload of new female clerks was an event discussed for days. The men wrote home saying the work was hard, and the money was good, and the wind was something you wouldn't believe. Those letters were opened and read before they left the site. That was normal. Everyone knew it. Nobody in 3 years wrote anything worth stopping. The third place is the one people think of when they think of any of this, and it was by far the smallest. Up a switchback road in northern New Mexico, 7,000 feet above the sea, on a flat topped mesa with canyons falling away on either side, there had been a boys' boarding school. Ranch school, they called it. Sons of wealthy families sent west to sleep on open porches through the winter and ride horses and become hardy. In late 1942, the school received a letter informing it that the property was being taken for the war effort, and by February the boys were gone and the trucks were coming up the road. What replaced them was a laboratory town of a few thousand people that would by the end hold one of the densest concentrations of scientific ability ever assembled in one place. They came from Berkeley and Chicago and Princeton, and from Britain and from every country in Europe that had spent the previous decade making its most brilliant people unwelcome. There were Nobel laureates walking to lunch in muddy boots. There were 22-year-old graduate students given responsibilities that would today be handed to a full professor. The average age on that mesa was under 30, and it was physically a mess. Everyone says so. The town was thrown up fast and cheap. Green painted apartment blocks, coal stoves that needed feeding, a water supply that failed regularly and had to be trucked in, unpaved roads that turned into the same orange soup as Tennessee whenever it rained or thawed. Ashley Pond sat in the middle of it. Fuller Lodge, the old school's log dining hall, became the social heart of the place. A handful of original stone cottages with actual bathtubs went to senior staff, and the road they stood on was universally known as Bathtub Row, and the resentment about it was mostly a joke and occasionally not. The tech area was fenced separately, inside the town's own fence, a fence within a fence within a fence. Badges again, guards again, certain buildings that even people with high clearance did not enter. But the rule was different up here, and this is the crucial thing. The man in charge of the laboratory fought for it and won against the general's instincts. Inside the tech area, The scientists talked to each other. There were colloquia. There were open arguments about the physics. A chemist could tell a metallurgist what he actually needed and why. The reasoning was that a research problem cannot be solved by people forbidden to compare notes, and it was almost certainly correct, and it made the Mesa the only place in the entire project where the whole picture existed in anybody's head, which meant the people on that Mesa knew exactly what they were building. Not vaguely, precisely. They knew the number, they knew the yield estimate, they knew the schedule, and they knew in some detail what it would do to a city. That is the difference between the hill and everywhere else, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. In Tennessee, 100,000 people slept easily because they did not know. Up here, 3,000 people knew and did the work anyway, and many of them did not sleep easily at all. And their letters and diaries from those years are full of a specific, gnawing, argued over unease that the rest of the project was carefully protected from. Here is your address: Post Office Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not a street, not a town, not a building, a box in a post office in a city 35 miles away that you visit perhaps once a month. Every person on that mesa, from the laboratory director to a machinist's wife to a newborn baby, shared it. Several thousand human beings with one address between them. The consequences pile up in ways that are almost funny until you think about them for a second longer. Your driver's license does not have your name on it, it has a number. If you are stopped by a state trooper down in the valley, you hand him a card identifying you as a numeral, and he has been told about this arrangement and lets you go. And it happens often enough that the troopers develop a whole private theory about what is going on up there. Your car has a stamped, serial numbered pass on the windshield. Your ration book is issued to the box. Your bank account is opened by an intermediary. If you had a professional reputation, if you were, before all this, a chemist with a decade of published work, you disappear from the journals entirely, and colleagues elsewhere assume you have died, or gone mad, or defected. And your children. This is the detail that lands hardest. Babies born on the mesa were issued birth certificates that gave their place of birth as Post Office Box 1663, Santa Fe County. There are people alive today who spent their adult lives explaining that document to passport clerks. The general in charge of the project became genuinely irritated about the birth rate up there on the grounds that it was inconvenient and asked the laboratory director to do something about it, and was told, in effect, that this was outside the director's authority. For the wives, the arrangement was its own peculiar sentence. Many of them were highly educated, physicists, mathematicians, chemists in their own right, women who had trained alongside their husbands and then found the doors quietly closing after the wedding. They arrived on the mesa, were handed an apartment with a coal stove and a temperamental water supply, and were told, more or less, to keep house at 7,000 feet in a town with no shops. A great many of them refused to accept that. They took jobs in the laboratory as computers, human ones, running calculations on mechanical desk machines and long relay chains, and later on punch card equipment, work that was absolutely essential and paid at clerical rates. Others taught in the school, or ran the library, or staffed the hospital, or kept the town's chaotic administration from collapsing. Some knew a great deal about what their husbands were doing. Some knew nothing and were not told, and had to construct a marriage around a locked room. They organized. They ran a school board, a nursery, a theater group, a lending library. They complained, collectively and effectively, about the housing and the water and the milk supply. One committee of women went to the director's office to argue about domestic arrangements and got most of what they asked for, which is more than several distinguished physicists managed that year. When it was over and the address became real again and their names came back, some of them said the strangest part was not the secrecy. It was how ordinary it had felt, day to day, to live in a place that officially did not exist. If you're still with me, half awake, half somewhere else, here's something to turn over while the story keeps going. Almost everybody in this story was told less than they wanted to know, and most of them found a way to be at peace with it. So, what's the thing your own family never explained? The job a grandparent had and wouldn't describe, the years nobody accounts for, the house that got sold, the name that stopped being mentioned. Leave it in the comments if you like. There's something companionable about a long list of small family mysteries, read slowly late at night. Now back to the fence and the dial and the sound of the shift whistle at midnight. You should assume at all three sites that somebody is paying attention, not in a paranoid way, in a boring administrative filing cabinet way, which is worse. Your mail is opened both directions. There is a censorship office with staff whose entire job is to read the correspondence of ordinary people and remove anything indiscreet. At the Mesa, the censorship was formal and acknowledged. Letters came back with cuts, and there were rules about what could be mentioned. No place names, no weather that might identify a region, no references to the number of people around you. At the Tennessee and Washington sites, the reading was less advertised but no less real. People adapt to this the way people adapt to anything. You develop a letter writing voice that is warm and completely empty. You write about the food and the movies and your roommate's dreadful boyfriend. You do not write about your work because you have nothing to say about your work, because you don't know anything about your work. And the censors, reading tens of thousands of these letters, found the same thing over and over, nothing to cut. The system had already done its job upstream. Then there were the people. Counterintelligence agents worked inside the plants, in ordinary jobs, at ordinary benches, and their co-workers did not know. Some of them were there for years. They were listening for a specific thing, anyone showing an unusual interest in the whole rather than the part, and mostly what they heard was gossip about supervisors and complaints about the bus service. The tests were real, though. There are documented cases of security staff sitting down next to a worker in a cafeteria, striking up a friendly conversation and steering it gently toward what do you actually do in there. Workers who took the bait were spoken to. Workers who reported the conversation were quietly noted as reliable. Nobody was told which had happened to them. And there was a reporting culture, unglamorous and effective. If your neighbor said something odd, you were expected to mention it. If somebody in your dormitory had a camera, you were expected to mention it. Most people never reported anything in 3 years. but everyone knew that everyone was expected to, and that knowledge sits in a room the way a third person sits in a room. Punishment, when it came, was usually not dramatic. Termination, an escort to the gate, a bus ticket, your name on a list somewhere. There are stories of workers who vanished between shifts and whose roommates were told nothing at all, and who turned up years later perfectly fine in another state, and stories where nobody ever found out. The remarkable thing, the thing the historians keep circling back to, is how well it held. 125,000 people at peak, 500,000 or so cycling through over the whole span, 3 years. And the American public, the Congress that funded it without knowing, and the newspapers that noticed the strange traffic in Tennessee and were quietly asked to look away, all remained essentially in the dark until the announcement. It was not a perfect wall. Information did leak from the one place where people knew enough to leak it, and the consequences of that ran through the next 40 years of the 20th century. But the workers held. The ordinary 100,000, the ones with the badges and the dials and the mud on their boots, went home and said, "I don't know," and meant it, and it worked. Here is the part that surprises people most, and it shouldn't. The secret cities were young, cash rich, and starved for entertainment, and so they were, on a Saturday night, an enormous amount of fun. The average age in Tennessee was somewhere around 27. Tens of thousands of people in their late teens and early 20s, most of them a long way from a parent for the first time, with money in their pocket and one day off, and nothing whatsoever to do but each other's company. So dances, constantly, in recreation halls, in cafeterias with the tables pushed back, on tennis courts with the net taken down, on wooden platforms built for the purpose. Live bands, jukeboxes, phonographs where there was nothing else. Big band swing, jitterbug, the slow ones at the end. The ratio of men to women's varied wildly by site and by shift, and where it tilted, the etiquette adjusted. Cut in dancing, dance cards, a system where a girl might get through 40 partners in an evening and have her feet destroyed by all of them. There were bowling alleys, there were roller rinks, there were 7 movie theaters in the Tennessee town alone, showing the same reels that were showing everywhere in America, and a full house on a wet Wednesday because there was nowhere else to be. There were tennis courts and swimming holes and a lake for boating. There were softball leagues with proper standings, and the rivalries between plant teams were fierce and long remembered, and men who spent the war forbidden to discuss their work discussed the second baseman at length. There were clubs for everything. Camera clubs, which is genuinely funny given the camera rules, and which mostly meant people photographing each other in yards and at picnics under strict conditions. Chess clubs, drama societies, choral groups, a symphony orchestra assembled from an astonishing depth of amateur talent, because when you scoop up 100,000 Americans, you also scoop up a great many people who can play the clarinet. On the Mesa, the parties became legendary in their own small circle. Square dances in the lodge, amateur theatricals, skiing in the winter on a rope tow the scientists built themselves, hiking into the canyons on Sundays, poker games, and a particular kind of highly competitive, practical joking that flourishes wherever very clever people are bored, safes opened for sport, notes left inside them, elaborate hoaxes constructed over weeks. At the desert site, With a workforce that was overwhelmingly male, the entertainment was blunter. The beer hall, the movie hut, the baseball diamond, fishing on the river, and long bus trips into town on payday that the site management viewed with resignation. And underneath all of it, the same thing. Nobody could talk about work, which meant that every conversation at every dance and every card game and every picnic had to be about something else, about home, about family, about whether the war would end this year, about music and food and the stupidity of the housing office and each other. People made friendships in those years of an intensity they never quite matched again, and several of them said afterward that they thought it was precisely because of the silence. Strip out the one subject that would normally fill the air, and what's left is people, just people, in a strange place, at a strange time, being genuinely interested in each other because there was nothing else to be interested in. They got married in extraordinary numbers. You can see it in the records. Chapels booked solid. Weekend after weekend of ceremonies, some of them arranged in a fortnight, most of them attended by people the bride and groom had known for less than a year. In one 12-month stretch in the Tennessee town, there were more weddings than a city that size would normally see in 3. The reasons are not mysterious. Take thousands of unattached young people, put them in one place, give them money, remove their parents, add a war that makes every plan feel provisional, and then remove their ability to talk about the largest thing in their lives. What's left to build a relationship on is the relationship. It moves fast. The practical obstacles were considerable, and everyone dealt with them the same way, by ignoring them. Housing was assigned by category, and a married couple with the right classifications could get a flat top or, in time, a small Semesto house. So marriage was also, unavoidably, a housing strategy, and everybody understood that, and it was joked about at every reception. 2 people in dormitories, 1 wedding, 1 door with your own key behind it. There were also the marriages that arrived already made, wives who came out to join husbands, sight unseen on the place, having been told only the box number. They stepped off buses into mud and were handed a set of keys and a coal ration and a map, and they made a home out of it, and a fair number of them described the first 6 weeks as the hardest thing they ever did. The secrecy did strange work inside marriages. If both of you worked in the plants, you could not compare days. He came home and said it was fine. She came home and said it was fine. If one of you knew more than the other, a woman married to an engineer in a restricted building, say, then there was a room in the house that was locked, and both of you could feel the door. Up on the mesa, where the scientists knew everything, the strain went the other way. Some told their wives quietly, in defiance of the rules. Some didn't, and their wives worked it out anyway, from the physics textbooks on the shelf, and the visitors at dinner, and the fact that the entire town had stopped sleeping properly in the spring of 1945. There were marriages that came out of it stronger for having carried something together, and marriages that did not survive the discovery of how much had been withheld. And there were the ordinary heartbreaks that any town of 100,000 generates, made stranger by the fence. Engagements that ended when one party was transferred without notice. Letters that stopped. Boys who went from the plant to the draft board and did not come back, and their girls who kept turning up to Saturday dances anyway, because the alternative was a dormitory room and a wall. A great many of these marriages lasted 50 and 60 years. When the survivors were finally interviewed in old age, sitting side by side, they told the story the same way almost every time. We met at a dance. I couldn't tell him what I did. He couldn't tell me what he did. We got married in April. And then always some version of, it was the best time of my life, and I didn't know what I was doing there. And I have thought about that every day since. Let's go inside the buildings for a while, because the buildings themselves deserve a moment. At the Tennessee site, there was a structure so large that people who worked in it for a year never saw all of it. 4 stories, laid out in a great flattened U, half a mile long on the longer leg, covering something like 44 acres under one roof. At the time, the largest building on Earth. It was built to separate isotopes by pushing uranium gas endlessly through thousands of stages of barrier material, each stage moving the needle a fraction of a percent. The barrier was the hardest single materials problem of the war. A metal membrane full of holes of a precisely correct microscopic size, in quantities measured in acres, manufactured to a consistency that did not exist in any industry. It failed and failed and failed. There is a story, well documented, of the entire barrier program being torn out and restarted late in the day with the plant already built on the judgment that the existing version would never work. And the gas itself, uranium hexafluoride, corrosive, reactive, hostile to nearly every material used in ordinary plumbing. Miles of pipe had to be nickel plated inside. Seals had to hold vacuums for months. Lubricants that would survive contact with it had to be invented from nothing, and were. The men who welded those pipes were told to work to standards no refinery would ever have asked for, with every joint radiographed and rejected work redone until it passed. They complained bitterly. They did it. Elsewhere on the site, the electromagnetic plant with its rows of dials had a problem of its own. The magnets needed copper for their windings in quantities that did not exist because every ounce of copper in the country was already committed, so the project borrowed silver instead. Thousands of tons of silver bullion taken out of the National Depository, drawn into strip, wound into coils, and carefully returned afterward, with the accounting done to a fraction of an ounce, and a Treasury official who insisted on referring to it not as tons, but as troy ounces, because that was how silver was measured, and he was not going to have his metal spoken of casually. At the desert site, the reactors, great stacked blocks of graphite, drilled through with thousands of channels, cooled by river water pumped in enormous volume, and returned warmer to the Columbia. And the separation canyons downstream of them, buildings hundreds of feet long with concrete walls many feet thick, operated entirely by remote control, because after the material had been through a reactor, no human being could go near it. Operators worked behind shielding, moving equipment with overhead cranes, watching through thick glass and periscopes, doing chemistry they could not touch. And everywhere, in all of it, the same rule. The welder did not know, the crane operator did not know, the girl at the dial did not know. The chemist knew his own step and not the step before it. There were exceptions who worked it out. Bright young technicians drafted into the special engineer detachments, men with physics degrees pulled out of the Army and set to work as lab assistants. Sometimes assembled the picture from the shape of the equipment alone and had a quiet word from a security officer for their trouble. Mostly, though, 100,000 people built the most complicated machine in history without being told it was a machine. There is a second badge, and it isn't for the guards. Clipped beside your identification in many buildings is a small holder containing a piece of photographic film. You are not told much about it beyond the fact that you must wear it and must hand it in. What it is doing is recording, in the slow chemical way film records things, how much invisible energy has passed through the space where your chest was standing. Every so often, the film goes off to be developed, and if the developed film is darker than it should be, somebody has a conversation with your supervisor and possibly with you. There are also the bottles, urine samples collected on a schedule from workers in certain areas, tested for traces of material that should not be inside a human being. Nobody explains the point of this either. You simply comply, the way you comply with everything, and you make the same joke about it as everyone else, and you go back to work. This is, historically, a remarkable thing. The discipline of health physics, the entire modern practice of monitoring people who work around radiation with dose limits and film badges and survey meters, and the assumption that safety is measured rather than guessed, was essentially invented during these years on these sites because the project's medical people insisted on it against a good deal of impatience. They set limits, they enforced them, sometimes by shutting down work. They built the instruments as they went, and by the standards of American heavy industry in the 1940s, the safety record was genuinely good, better than the shipyards, better than the mines, better than the chemical plants that operated without any of this fuss. The men who ran the medical side were proud of it and had reason to be, but it was not clean, and the honest version has to say so. There were chemical hazards everywhere, some of them poorly understood, and workers were exposed to fluorine compounds and mercury and solvents in ways that would horrify a modern safety officer. There were accidents. There were people who breathed something they shouldn't have and were sent home without ever learning what it was. At the desert site, radioactive material went into the river and into the air in quantities that were monitored, recorded, and considered acceptable at the time, and that the surrounding communities have spent the decades since asking hard questions about. And there was a program of medical research on human subjects conducted under the project's authority, in which patients were injected with radioactive material to study how the body handled it without meaningful consent, sometimes without being told anything at all. It was small in scale and enormous in what it says. It came fully into public view only decades later when the files were opened and a formal apology was made by the government to the families. It belongs in this story, spoken plainly and without decoration, because the people it happened to were not consulted then and should at least be named as real now. So you wear the film badge and you fill the bottle and you go home. Most of the people who did that lived long, ordinary lives, and some of them got sick in ways that were later connected to those years and compensated for decades on by a program set up when the arguing finally stopped. The film comes back clear. You are told nothing, which means everything is fine. Human beings cannot leave a gap alone. Tell 100,000 people that they may not know what they are making, and they will make something up, and the something they make up will circulate the buses and cafeterias until it is practically a folk tradition. The guesses were wonderful. The most popular, by a distance, was that they were manufacturing the front ends of horses to be shipped to Washington for final assembly. This is not a joke, I have added. It was told constantly at all three sites by people who found it very funny and repeated it for 3 years. Beyond that, they were making a new kind of paint. They were making synthetic rubber. They were making a death ray. They were making a nose for a bomb that would sink through the earth. They were making 4-cent stamps. They were making something for the president personally. And one persistent rumor at the Tennessee site held that the whole enterprise was a colossal boondoggle, a fake, a project designed to soak up money and workers and produce absolutely nothing, and that everybody would be embarrassed when it came out. That last one had real traction. Congressional visitors thought it. Local farmers who had been moved off their land thought it. Workers who could see the mountains of material going in and nothing at all coming out thought it, and said so, and the plant managers could not correct them. A few people got much closer. There were technicians who had read the physics journals of the late 1930s and noticed, as scientists noticed everywhere, that a whole line of research on uranium had abruptly vanished from print in 1940, which is exactly the kind of silence that tells you where to look. There were chemists who recognized the reagents. There were engineers who calculated the power draw of the site, compared it to the size of the output shipments, and concluded that whatever was being made, it was being made in quantities that would fit in a coffee cup, and that this implied something very particular. Almost all of them kept it to themselves. That's the interesting part. A person who has worked out the secret and knows that working it out is itself dangerous does not go around explaining. They eat lunch, they mention nothing, and there were the ones who nearly stumbled into it sideways. A newspaper cartoon strip ran a storyline involving an atomic device and drew official attention. A pulp science fiction story described a uranium bomb closely enough that agents visited the magazine's office, only to find that the author had assembled the whole thing from public physics papers written before the blackout, which was a much more frightening answer than espionage. Most people never guessed at all and never tried. They knew it was for the war. They knew it was important because of the sheer scale of what was being spent. They knew that men were dying in the Pacific and in Europe, and that this was, somehow, connected to that. That was enough. You would be astonished how enough it was. Children grew up in these towns, thousands of them, and when you talk to them now, they are in their 80s and 90s, and quite a few have written it down. What they describe is not a prison. It is one of the happiest childhoods imaginable. Think about the geometry of it. Every family in town is new. Every family has a parent in the same industry. There are no old cliques, no established families, no wrong side of town in the usual sense. The whole population is between 20 and 40, so the whole population has small children, so the streets are full of them. There is no crime worth mentioning, because there are armed guards on every road out, and nobody can get in. Parents let children roam from breakfast to dark, across construction sites, and woods, and half-built roads, in a way that would give a modern parent heart failure. The schools were unexpectedly excellent. The projects needed to attract skilled people, and skilled people asked about schools, so money was spent. Teachers were recruited hard and paid well, and there was a hidden bonus. In a town stuffed with scientists and engineers, the substitute teacher covering your physics class might be somebody who would later have a prize named in his general vicinity. Children at the Mesa School were taught by people who genuinely knew the material, and the Mesa's high school graduating classes went on to universities at rates that startled everyone. The children knew the rules. They knew the badge system and could read the colors and knew which parent could go where. They knew that you didn't ask daddy about the plant. They took gate passes for granted the way children take anything for granted. A child who has never known anything else does not find a fence strange. A fence is simply where the world ends, and every child's world ends somewhere. Some of them built elaborate fantasies about it. Some of them made the same jokes as their parents. Some of them, being children, worked out more than the adults expected and traded theories in the schoolyard and were mostly wrong in imaginative ways. There were the small hardships. Doctors were army doctors, and the hospitals were basic, and an illness that needed a specialist meant a long trip out. Certain goods simply weren't available, and there was the constant churn. Friends transferred out without warning, families gone between one Friday and the next, a desk suddenly empty, and nobody explaining. Children learned to hold friendships loosely, which is a lesson that stays with you. At the Mesa, the birth rate was so high it became an administrative joke, the hospital delivering babies at a rate no one had planned for, all of them with the same address on the certificate. Those children, later, formed something like a diaspora. There are reunions. There is a shared identity among people who were born in a place that was not on any map, whose birth certificates say a post office box, whose parents never really told them the whole thing. And here is the odd, tender part. Many of those children didn't learn what their parents had been doing until August of 1945, at the same moment as the rest of the world, standing in a kitchen listening to a radio. They watched their mother's face change. That's the memory. Not the news, the face. By the winter of 1944 into 1945, something has changed in the air of all three places, and you can feel it, even though nobody says a word. The pace goes up, shifts get longer, days off get quietly canceled, and then formally canceled. Supervisors who were relaxed become short tempered. Men appear from Washington and walk the floor in suits and are gone by evening. In the Tennessee plants, the tolerance for a stopped machine drops to nothing. A needle that won't settle now brings 3 people at a run instead of 1. And there are the shipments. This is the detail workers noticed and remembered and could not talk about. Small things leaving, absurdly small. After months of watching train after train arrive loaded with steel and chemicals and coal, you see an armed detail escort a case out of the building, and the case is the size of a lunch pail, and it goes into a car with soldiers in it, and the car goes out the gate. That's the output. Somewhere in your mind, a piece of arithmetic completes itself, and you deliberately do not finish it. The exhaustion is general. People are working 70-hour weeks in the 3rd year of it. There are more accidents on the roads, more absences, more arguments in the cafeterias. The bus drivers, who have the best overview of anyone, will tell you the mood of the entire town by the third week of January 1945, and the mood is grim and grinding and impatient. The war news doesn't help. Europe is clearly ending, and the Pacific clearly is not. Everyone knows somebody. The casualty estimates being discussed in the newspapers for an invasion of the Japanese home islands are enormous, and the newspapers print them, and every worker with a brother in a uniform reads them at the breakfast table. Up on the mesa, the winter is different in kind. There, they know what the schedule means, and the schedule is now measured in weeks. Nobody sleeps properly. The colloquia get sharper. There are arguments about a design problem so severe it required a whole second weapon concept to be developed in parallel on a deadline, with the outcome genuinely uncertain until very late. There are physicists losing weight and losing their tempers. There is a man on that mesa whose wife is dying in a sanatorium down in the valley, and who drives down to see her when he can, and who comes back and does the work. And in the spring, in the Tennessee plants, the strangest thing yet, a few of the operators are moved to different duties, and some of the machines are run down, and rumors start that the plant is closing. Nothing is explained. What has actually happened is that the material is nearly finished. There is not much left to separate. The girl at the dial notices her needle behaving differently in the last weeks because the feed is different now, and she asks nobody about it, and she keeps it steady. By early July, most of the people at all three sites know only that something is coming. They know it the way you know a storm is coming, a change in pressure, a smell, birds going quiet, not a fact, a feeling. Then a group of men leave the mesa in a convoy heading south, and they don't come back for a few days. And when they come back, they look like they have not slept, and they will not meet anyone's eye, and something in the town has changed. 200 miles south of the mesa, in a stretch of New Mexico desert, whose Spanish name translates roughly to the journey of death, there is a steel tower 100 feet high, standing in scrub. There is a base camp of tents and huts. There are bunkers of concrete and earth at measured distances. And on the night of July 15th, 1945, in the middle of a thunderstorm nobody planned for, there are a few hundred exhausted people waiting for a rain to stop. They wait most of the night. The rain matters enormously for the electrical safety of the device, for the weather that will carry whatever comes afterward, for a dozen calculations that have all been made and remade. The test is delayed. The men who have argued for 3 years about whether this will work at all sit in the dark, listening to thunder. There is a betting pool on the yield. Some of the entries are jokes. One well-known physicist has bet on essentially nothing at all as a wry insurance policy. There is also, quietly, a calculation done and redone about whether the atmosphere itself could ignite, which had been ruled out on paper years before, and which nobody in that desert is thinking about with complete calm at 4:30 in the morning. At 29 minutes past 5, the sky turns white. Not bright, white. The people who were there reach for the same words in every account, and none of them are satisfied with the words. A light that came from everywhere at once, a light with no shadow in it, a light that lit the mountains 15 miles away like a photographer's flash and held them lit for several seconds in colors nobody had names for: gold, violet, green, and then a rolling ball of fire climbing. And only then, 30 seconds or a minute later, the sound, arriving late and enormous, banging off the hills and coming back again. Men who had built it for 3 years lay face down in the sand behind bunkers, with their eyes shut and their arms over their heads, and felt heat on the back of their necks from a thing standing 10 miles away. Some of them cheered, some of them shook hands, some of them said nothing at all for a long time, and were still not saying anything when the sun came up properly an hour later. 120 miles away, a woman in a rest home saw the flash through her window and asked what it was. Windows rattled in towns across the state. A blind woman riding in a car reported seeing light. The story that went out to the newspapers said an ammunition magazine had exploded at an air base, that there were no casualties, and that some residents might have noticed the blast. Back on the mesa, the people who had stayed behind knew almost immediately. Word came up the road, unofficially, the way word does. Someone had watched from a mountainside north of the site and driven back. A general feeling spread through a town of 3,000 people in a couple of hours. It worked. The reactions did not sort neatly. There was relief and pride and a real and uncomplicated joy that 3 years of impossible work had come good. There was also, in the diaries written that week, a lot of very quiet, very careful sentences by people trying to describe a feeling they had not been given a word for, and mostly failing. In Tennessee and in Washington, nobody knew anything at all. The dials were watched, the shifts changed, the buses ran. 3 weeks passed. It is a Monday in August, and it is hot, and you are doing whatever you do. The news arrives at different sites in different ways, but the shape is always the same: sudden, public, and from outside. Nobody from the project tells you first. You find out the way a farmer in Iowa finds out, from a radio or a newspaper, except that halfway through the sentence, you realize the announcer is describing you. In the Tennessee town, loudspeakers carry it. Newsboys run through the streets with a special edition whose headline says, at last, what the plant makes. Workers coming off shift are handed a paper, be a boy shouting the word they have been forbidden to say for 3 years. In some buildings, supervisors call people together and read the announcement out. In others, the word simply moves through the floor, person to person, faster than any official channel, and the town goes off like a firework. That's the honest first reaction, and it is important not to sand it down. There was cheering, there was dancing in the streets, there were car horns and impromptu parades, and strangers embracing, and a great many people crying with what was unmistakably relief. Because the second half of the news, arriving right behind the first, was that this might end the war. And ending the war meant brothers coming home. It meant the invasion that everyone had been reading casualty projections about might not happen. For a town where nearly every family had somebody in uniform, that was not an abstraction. That was the whole world arriving at once. Underneath the celebration ran something else, and it was almost giddy. We did it. For 3 years, you had been told you were doing something important and had no way to check. Now you knew. The dial you watched, the pipe you welded, the floor you mopped, The bus you drove, it had been part of that. The girl at the panel, who had never been told what the needle measured, understood, in a single sentence from a radio, what her 3 years had been for. People described a feeling of the whole picture snapping into place, like a word you have been trying to remember all day. Coworkers turned to each other and finally, legally, talked. Married couples came home and said, at last, what they did. There are accounts of husbands and wives sitting at a kitchen table discovering they had been working on the same thing in different buildings for 2 years and laughing about it until they weren't laughing. At the mesa, they already knew, and there was a party, and it was loud, and one young physicist has left a description of walking out of it into the dark because he could not stay inside it, and finding a colleague already out there being sick behind a building. 3 days later, there was a second one, and then 6 days after that, it was over. The war was over, and the celebration that followed was, at all three sites and everywhere else in the country, the largest outpouring of pure, uncomplicated joy that the 20th century produced. That is where a certain kind of telling stops. It shouldn't, because the sun came up the next day and the day after, and people had to go on living inside what they had just been told. It took a while for the other thing to arrive, and it arrived differently for everyone. In the first days, there were only numbers and a shape. Then, gradually, over weeks and months, came the photographs and the film, and eventually the reporting from people who had walked through those cities. And 100,000 workers who had cheered on a Monday in August began to understand, slowly in their own time, what had been at the far end of the thing they had made a small part of. There is no single reaction to record because there wasn't one. Anybody who tells you the workers all felt guilty is selling you something, and so is anybody who tells you they all felt fine. Many were and remained at peace with it. They had lived through 4 years of a war they did not start, in which cities had been burned from the air on every side, and hundreds of thousands of civilians had already died that way, and they held to the view that this ended it, and that the alternative would have killed far more. A great many of them had a brother or a husband in a transport ship in the Pacific in July of 1945, who was still alive in September, and for those people, the moral arithmetic was settled and stayed settled for the rest of their lives, and they did not appreciate being lectured about it later. Others carried something quieter. Women who had watched a dial described a moment, sometimes years afterward, when it landed properly, usually in front of a photograph, usually of a child. There are interviews recorded in the 1980s and 1990s where a woman in her 60s is perfectly composed talking about the mud and the dances and the dormitory, and then stops talking altogether when the interviewer asks about August. And some were clear that they would not have done it if they had known, and said so plainly, and had spent decades thinking about the fact that they had never been given the chance to decide. That is the specific wound that compartmentalization leaves. You cannot consent to something you were not told about. Whatever comfort or discomfort you eventually arrive at, you have to arrive at it retroactively about a thing you already did. On the mesa, where they had known all along, the reckoning was public and immediate and fierce. Within months, scientists who had built it were organizing, publishing, lobbying, and arguing in Washington about control of what they had made. Several resigned. Several never worked on weapons again. Several spent the rest of their lives on the problem of preventing the use of the thing they had spent 3 years perfecting, and considered that the actual work of their lives. Petitions had circulated even before at the Chicago laboratory, asking that the weapon be demonstrated rather than used, or not used at all. They were signed by dozens of people who had helped create it. They did not change what happened, and 100,000 people in 3 towns went back to work on Tuesday because the plants did not close, and there were still shifts to cover and rent to pay, and the war being over did not mean the year was. The strange thing, the thing survivors say most often, is how little any of them talked about it. Not then, not for decades. They came home and they were quiet, and their children grew up knowing only that mom worked in Tennessee during the war. The habit of not saying had gone very deep. Some of them never really lost it. There is a small, sad story that belongs here, and it is short. In the weeks after the war ended, work on the Mesa continued. There were experiments still to run, measurements still to take on the behavior of the material itself, how close it could be brought to the edge of a chain reaction, and how you would know you were near it. The experiments were done by hand, on a bench, with blocks and reflectors, and a great deal of care, and the people who did them called the procedure by a name that told you exactly how they felt about it, tickling the dragon's tail. In late August of 1945, a young physicist working alone in the evening made a mistake with a stack of blocks. He knew instantly. He moved to correct it with his own hands and did correct it, and in doing so absorbed a dose that could not be survived. He died a few weeks later, at 24. The following spring, a colleague of his was demonstrating a related experiment to a group of observers using a screwdriver to hold 2 halves of a shell fractionally apart. The screwdriver slipped. There was a blue flash and a wave of heat. He pulled the assembly apart with his bare hands in under a second, which almost certainly saved the 7 other people in the room, and which meant he had taken nearly all of it himself. He died 9 days later. He was 35. They were not the only ones. Across all 3 sites and the network of laboratories and plants feeding them, there were the deaths that any construction project of that scale produces: falls, machinery, vehicles, the ordinary catalog of industrial death in the 1940s. And there were chemical exposures and burns and men who were injured and quietly compensated and went home. A project employing hundreds of thousands over 3 years does not do so without a cost paid in individual people, and the individual people mostly do not have their names remembered. But those too are remembered, partly because the circumstances were so stark, and partly because of what followed. After the second accident, the practice changed completely. Nobody assembled critical material by hand again. Remote handling became the rule, permanently, everywhere. The experiments were moved to a canyon, run by machines, with the operators a quarter-mile away behind a hill. 2 men died on a laboratory bench, and every person who has worked with that material since has done so at a distance because of it. There is a particular kind of sorrow in a story like that, and it isn't dramatic. It's the sorrow of a young man in a quiet building on a summer evening, doing careful work, making one wrong movement with his hand, and knowing in the same instant everything that follows. He wrote it up. That's the detail that stays. He recorded what had happened and what he had done wrong so that the record would be right. Rest for them too tonight. The towns did not vanish when the war ended, though a great many people expected them to. The construction workforce melted away almost overnight. Tens of thousands of men who had been building things that were now built released within weeks. The desert camp emptied so fast that whole barracks stood open to the wind. Trailers were hauled out by the hundred. In Tennessee, the population fell by half and then kept falling, and the housing office that had spent 3 years desperately assigning rooms spent the next three trying to fill them. But the plants stayed. The work turned out to have a future, and the future had a name, and the name was the next 40 years. Reactors kept running on the Columbia. Isotope work continued in Tennessee, and the site turned itself, over time, into a national laboratory doing science that had nothing to do with weapons, medical isotopes, biology, materials, computing. The Mesa remained a laboratory. The people who stayed became a permanent population instead of a temporary one and started to behave like one, which meant arguing about the fence. Because a town where the government owns every house and every shop and the newspaper, where the police answer to an army engineer, where your address is a box, and you cannot invite your mother for the weekend without applying for a pass. That town is tolerable as a wartime emergency and intolerable as a way to live. Residents began to say so loudly in a country that had just spent 4 years being told what it was fighting for. There were petitions and town meetings and a good deal of local newspaper writing about the fundamental American peculiarity of a fenced city. It took until the spring of 1949. On the 19th of March, at the Tennessee site, they opened the gates. They did it with an enormous amount of ceremony because Americans in 1949 knew how to do this sort of thing. There was a parade. There was a motorcade of film stars brought in for the day. There was a ribbon across the road cut with a burst from a torch, and a band, and speeches, and a crowd of people who had spent 6 years showing a badge to walk to their own front door, standing in the road watching a barrier go up for good. People wept, some of them for what you'd expect, some of them, oddly, out of something closer to loss, because the fence had also meant something, and what it had meant was that everyone inside it was in it together, and that nobody locked a door, and that the children could go anywhere, and that the whole peculiar, intense, compressed world of those years had an edge to it that made it a world. Now it was just a town in Tennessee. The desert site never opened and hasn't. It is still a restricted federal reservation, now the largest and most complicated environmental cleanup effort in the country, with a workforce still measured in the thousands, still working on the consequences of what was done there in 3 fast years in the 1940s. The Mesa opened its gates in 1957, kept its laboratory, and became a small mountain city with an unusually high number of doctorates per square mile and a very good school system. And the people who had come as 19-year-olds with a suitcase and a letter that explained nothing were now in their 30s, with children and mortgages and a story they still couldn't quite tell. Let's come back to you one last time before the story lets you go. You came here on a bus through a gate into mud at 19 or 25 or 40. You were given a badge and a bed and a task, and you were told nothing, and you did the task well for 3 years, because that was what was asked of you, and because the money was good, and because there was a war on, and everybody's brother was somewhere. You made friends in a way you never quite managed again. You danced most Saturdays. You ate in a steel cafeteria at 3 in the morning and thought it was fine. You got married, possibly, to somebody you'd known for 4 months, and it lasted 50 years. You learned to walk a boardwalk in the dark. You learned to say, I don't know, and mean it. You watched a needle and kept it steady, and there is a real sense in which the war ended slightly sooner because you were good at that, and you will never be able to say by how much, and neither can anybody else. You went home afterward. Most people did. Back to Tennessee or Kentucky or Ohio or wherever the letter had found you, with money in the bank and a work history you couldn't describe, and a habit of not talking that you'd practiced until it was permanent. And what you carried was complicated and stayed complicated, and you mostly kept it to yourself. Some of it was pride, and it was earned. You were part of the largest, strangest, most audacious industrial effort ever mounted, executed in 3 years by people who were mostly making it up as they went. And it worked, and almost nothing on that scale works. You built a city out of a cow pasture. You built the largest building in the world and filled it with a machine nobody had ever made before. You did it while being told nothing, and you did it well. Some of it was money, and that was real too. Houses got bought, children went to school, a generation of families in poor counties stepped up a rung and stayed there. Some of it was the fence and the hutments and the fact that a husband and wife could stand 200 yards apart on the same site and not be permitted to share a room. You knew about that then. Everyone did. And some of it was August, and the photographs that came afterward, and a question you were never given the chance to answer in advance. You were not asked. That's the thing to hold at the end. 125,000 people were deliberately kept from knowing what they were doing by a system designed with great care to make certain of it, and it succeeded completely. Whether you'd have said yes is a question you gotta ask yourself only afterward, alone, for the rest of your life. Some said yes, some said no, most said something in between and didn't finish the sentence. The historians will keep arguing about the decision, and they should, and it is not a question that closes. But the people are not the argument. The people were a girl from a farm who turned a knob for 8 hours and sent her wages home, a welder who did the finest work of his career on a pipe he was not allowed to ask about, a janitor who lived apart from her husband for 3 years and mailed money to her children, a 24-year-old in a quiet laboratory who wrote down his own mistake so the next person wouldn't make it. They were ordinary? That's the whole point. Extraordinary things are almost always built by ordinary people who were told very little and worked very hard and went home on the bus. So let it all settle now, slowly, the way orange clay settles out of water when you finally stop stirring it. The buses have finished their last run. The boardwalks are empty and the plank ends are silvered with frost. In the great curved building, the dials still glow faintly and the needles hold steady, watched by a night shift of young women who will be replaced at midnight and go back to a dormitory and sleep with the sound of machinery still humming somewhere behind their ears. Out west, the wind has dropped at last, and the desert is cold and enormous and full of stars, and 50,000 men are asleep in ranks of barracks with sand in their blankets. On the mesa, snow is on the pines, and a coal stove is ticking as it cools, and someone is walking home late along a road that isn't on any map, past a fence, past a guard who nods toward a green apartment building where the light is on because a baby with a post office box for a birthplace has decided that 2 in the morning is a fine time to be awake. None of them know what they are making. Almost none of them ever will until a Monday in August when a radio tells them all at once. For now, they are simply people at the end of a shift in a place that doesn't officially exist, doing careful work for reasons they've been asked to take on trust, and sleeping, most of them, remarkably well. Thank you for spending this time here tonight. If this journey kept you company, subscribe so the next one finds you. And I'd still love to read the oldest story your family tells down in the comments. There's a whole quiet archive of them building up down there. Let your breathing slow. Let your jaw unclench. Let the fence and the mud and the badge and the needle all drift away into the dark. Rest easy. Sleep well. This is drowsy history.